All right, I want to watch the high guru of transit. His name is Jarrett Walker, the high guru. He has cult following in the thousands. And yeah, my riff with Jarrett happened in 2011 when Neil McFarlane hid himself and all of his cronies a raise. He gave himself a raise at the exact same time he cut my benefits. He cut Fairless Square, and he raised the fares, and he cut our health insurance. And he did that all while he secretly gave himself a raise. And that started an investigation with the Secretary of State, which was nothing but a whitewash. And Jarrett defended it. And that's where he lost my respect and credibility, when he actually defended McFarlane's raise. And I know he knows his stuff, but he is a tool of the public transportation industrial complex. And I know that for sure because of what he did then. Because there was no justification for what McFarlane had done. But yet he was defending it. So let's hear what he's got to say.
Welcome to Remix's third webinar on COVID-19 Transportation Policy Series. I'm Rachel Zach, Policy Director at Remix, a single platform that enables cities to see their mobility data in one place, plan a holistic network, and coordinate across stakeholders. We're hosting this webinar from San Francisco, where we are sheltering in place and working virtually. So we leave our homes for essential items only. We are deeply saddened by the impact of this pandemic to our own transport services, such as Muni and BART, whose ridership has been down 90%, as well as the impact to agencies across the U.S. and the 300 plus transportation agencies supported by our software across the globe.
BART's ridership is down 90%. 90%. And they just approved a tax increase for BART over there, too.
We will talk about this today. We're going to get really deep on it. So alarmed by what we were seeing, we started this series to make sure our global community of operators has direct access to new information.
Oh, you mean companies?
As well as has a forum for sharing what they are experiencing as quickly as possible. So the format of the series today will be 30 minutes of conversation between me and today's guest, Jarrett Walker, followed by 15 minutes of time where we respond to questions from the audience. As these questions occur during your talk, please submit your questions through the Q&A box. This way they'll be recorded and we can make sure that they get answered. We have a special request to keep the questions on fixed route transit. We are trying to make sure that today's speaker speaks to his expertise, and we will have, we've had conversations about policy in previous webinars, and in the future we're sitting down with transit centers, so just keep that in mind in terms of what you ask today. So as I mentioned, and as I'm sure you're feeling, conditions are changing rapidly. And many of you might have information you'd like to share with your peers on how your agency is responding and the conditions you've had to make in light of, or the other considerations you've had to make in light of the emergency and nature of the COVID-19 public health policies. We encourage you to share an update now or during the talk in the chat box. So that will be shared publicly across different
here she is up there in the corner.
And
all right, come on, move along.
Also a Remix user on transit ridership.
Let's see what we got here.
And you can see
look at this
screen share. We love you, Jarrett. Welcome.
Yeah, we love you, Jarrett. I know that the high guru. He's definitely the high guru. I think he's the #1 transit consultant in the world.
We love you too, Rachel.
I bet you do.
So let's dive right in.
Where?
So our friends at Transit App are tracking the demand drop from their users, which I think illustrates the magnitude of impact of these public
minus 72%.
social distancing,
wow,
and transit ridership.
It's
and you can see in the screen share just how dramatically this is occurring across all the nation.
Cow.
So what happens when a transit agency is faced with this type of a
greater TriMet 76?
And what types of decisions are they facing?
I realize that the transit isn't unusual in this respect, but it's horrific. It's catastrophic. Let's just understand what happens to a transit agency budget.
Okay.
First of all, the bigger transit agencies in particular get quite a bit of their revenue from fares. Some of the big...
He's talking about the East Coast, because the East Coast does, the West Coast doesn't.
Subway systems are way...
New York City has, I think it accounts for like 75% of all transit ridership in the United States comes from New York City alone. That's, that's the one place that actually does use transit. And it runs 24 hours. It's very efficient, but it's been neoliberal out too, and it's all turned into crap.
Are typically over 50%. Many big city bus systems are 20, 30, 40% fare revenue. So what that means is all that revenue is gone, right? Yeah. The ridership is pretty much gone, and what is and so all that fare revenue has disappeared. Some agencies, of course, are also offering free fares as a way of enabling people to board the rear door for social distancing purposes. That's to protect the drivers, fundamentally. So with all that happening, there's basically suddenly no fare revenue. That's suddenly 20, 30, 40, 50 or more % of the budget gone. Then where does the rest of transit budget come from? Well, it's mostly from local tax sources. Unfortunately, some parts of government get to run on property taxes, which are extremely stable, but transit gets to run on sales taxes and payroll taxes for the most part, which are extremely low. People lose their jobs, payroll tax goes down. Payroll tax goes down, people lose their jobs, they stop spending as much money, sales tax goes down. And the other thing that's happening right now is that suddenly we're all shopping online, and not every local government has been able, there's been a lot of work on this, but not every local government has been able to get sales tax money all the way back to the location of the buyer for special governments like transit agencies. It's terrible. So there really is no part of the transit agency's income stream that is not likely to collapse at this point.
Yeah. So in terms of that, sorry, that's really overwhelming. What types of decisions do they face looking at this future?
The most immediate thing that's happening is that they are being expected to do everything they can to address the immediate public health emergency, which they're being told is a higher priority than balancing their budget or keeping the lights on. So the huge cleaning and disinfecting programs that are happening are expensive. The social distancing that is causing them, for example, to protect their drivers boarding through the rear door, that's expensive. You've given up fare revenue. Running large buses and trains solely in order to provide social distance is expensive. And all those things are happening now. And so at the same time that these expensive obligations, and I'm not saying that the transit agencies shouldn't be doing those things, it's just we need to recognize why they're doing them. They're doing them for a public health reason, not because it's good for ridership or good for their bottom line. Because of that, they are looking at their budgets and wondering how long they're going to be able to keep the lights on, wondering how long they're going to be able to function. And so that's what's driving, two things are driving now the service cuts that we're seeing, actually. One is just agencies looking ahead to their budgets and trying to figure out how to reduce their costs to the point that they don't just collapse.
Okay, let me interrupt just for a quick second. So far, I have no issue with anything he's saying. But notice how there's no mention of getting rid of any of the bureaucracy here. We've already been through this in 2008 and 2007. Those of you who are around, we went through the exact same thing. all those people got a what was it, furlough for a week or two, if I remember correctly. All those bureaucrats, those overpaid people, they got 2 weeks off, I think, without pay. That was their participation in the crisis. The bus drivers, we lost our fully paid health care, which we were promised. The riders had saw these huge fare increases, and now he's now. I'll bet you $1 to a donut. He will not bring up the bureaucracy. He never does.
And the other is that many agencies are having trouble getting enough people to come to work. Understandably, you've got drivers who are, having sniffles and coughs. You have drivers who are actually clearly sick. And then you just have lots of drivers who, for whatever reason, are, would prefer not to expose themselves and feel like they don't need the money that badly. So
Yeah, right.
Vacation time.
So far, he's spot on all of that.
And so suddenly it's very hard to staff. So both of those things are converging to drive these service cuts.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing that comes up now is, okay, how do you cut service? How do you cut service in a way that minimizes the damage? And again, the primary imperative that the transit agencies are operating under is to keep the essential services going. The person who is bagging your groceries and taking them out to the curb for you may very well needed to get to work on transit. The nurse who's trying to save lives at the hospital.
This is the ultimate irony of the situation we are in this morally bankrupt, upside down country we inhabit. Is the people that pay the least now turn out to be the ones that are the most important. And the people that are paid the most have no use to the public at all. That's how absurd our culture is. I've known this for a long time, and I've argued with various friends of mine about how this empire was going to end, and most people say it's going to be a very slow ending, and I said no, it's going to be quick. And we are at a time of unbelievable collapse, and people don't realize what's actually going to happen to them here. It's going to be very bad, worse than anything. This is historic events that are happening here, not only because of the virus, but because we have these sociopaths in charge during this. So the virus can be beat, but the sociopath cancer human beings that live off us can't be beat. They have us in a headlock.
We all need a transit to get there. So, we have a real societal breakdown in essential services if transit doesn't keep running to provide that access. So for that reason, and let me
point out, okay, there's been some of us arguing for fare-free transit for years. And we've just proven our case. We've proven our case. The case is closed with this pandemic. This is why transit should have never been funded on fares in the first place. Because of this. It should have been a public utility. You don't see them closing streets. Sorry, we're closing the street because we don't have anybody to keep it open. I mean, this should have been a public utility. All right? And it's not. They've treated it as some kind of a business. And now it's failed because capitalism has failed. Hasn't been any capitalism here. It's always been socialism for the rest and for the rich, and capitalism for the rest of us. And this is the second bailout in 12 years. This is the second time. So capitalism has already failed. It's failed, and now it fails again.
Also, what we've seen in the ridership is very interesting, which is that ridership has utterly collapsed on commute-oriented services, or us in the laptop set.
Yeah, all of the people who are so-called the choice riders, they're not going to be. Those people are gone forever. Okay, that was always a failed policy in the first place. This whole, I was just looking at the feed and the urbanism idea of this just goes to prove, that the urbanist idea and the reliance on public transportation and the reliance on government in general is a very idiotic thing to do, because it's not there for you. Not the government we have is only here as a kleptocracy. It's not here for us. It's a kleptocracy to make sure the elite oligarchs maintain their wealth. And it's all collapsed. This fast. And it's been by design.
For folks in the laptop set who only ride transit at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. and are riding an express bus in from the suburbs, those have just dropped practically to zero in many cases.
Yep, he's right.
And so those are quite sensibly among the first things that transit agencies have cut, because there's no point really in trying to compete with the private car market. Right now, there's no traffic, there's plenty of parking, and understandably, people are seeing their cars as a safer environment in terms of protection from the virus than public transit is. I can't argue with that right now. Mm-hmm. So services that are trying to compete with driving are pretty much collapsing. The other kinds of service where ridership is collapsing is anything remotely tourist or recreational oriented, because of course nobody's doing that. So what remains, and the thing that, I'm hoping that agencies can save as much as possible, is that all day, all the time, everywhere to everywhere, local fixed route network, bus and rail, that is there so that to keep all of the essential functions of the city going. Remember, what we think of as essential functions of the city are overwhelmingly low-wage jobs. Mm-hmm. Overwhelming. Yeah. These are not going to be people who can necessarily afford to have cars, afford to drive.
He's right. He's right.
So public transit.
I never said this guy was stupid. He's brilliant. I already knew that.
Has to be there as part of the essential service. And that's what they're looking at. And so transit agencies are now dealing, as always, with conflicting expectations. Is this a business or is it a social service? It's another example of the same.
I tried to get this guy to apply for general manager for TriMet. He was in Portland. He lives in Portland now. And I asked him to apply, and he said no. Can you imagine if this guy was actually the general manager of TriMet? That could have been one of the most interesting developments in U.S. public transportation in history. But he didn't take it. I guess not. They didn't want him there. He's not a professional technocrat like Kelsey, for example, who has no connection to Portland or anything in Portland or the people of Portland. He's just a professional technocrat. He's only there for the career part. He's there for himself, not for anybody else.
Crazy contradictory direction that we give transit agencies all the time. And they're both, and someone has to balance these competing goals because they lead in opposite directions. The service cuts that we're seeing now, when transit agencies have to go beyond cutting the peak and cutting the recreational stuff, they start going to reducing frequencies. Many transit agencies are running a Saturday or Sunday schedule on weekdays now. Mm-hmm. I think more alarmingly, some transit agencies are starting to cut span, cut overnight service. Those are more worrisome because there you do have people with no alternatives who are potentially stranded by those cuts. The frequency reductions are no small matter either. Frequency reductions mean that connections on which the network relies stop functioning, that a transfer that you could make in 7 minutes suddenly becomes 27 minutes. And that can very quickly turn into making the trip non-viable for somebody who has to actually get to work. So, I've been encouraging from the beginning, by all means, cut those peak express services, by all means, cut recreational services, turn frequencies down to 15, but be very careful about turning 15s down to 30 or 30s down to 60, because then things just start not functioning. Of course, what transit agencies have, for the most part, they have a Saturday and Sunday schedule built, so they tend to switch to that. With a few exceptions like Houston, where I'm proud to have worked, where the Saturday and Sunday schedule is basically identical to weekday without the peak. Most transit agencies still have pretty dismal Saturday and Sunday levels of service, and in many cases, Saturday and Sunday schedules are already built in ways that provide very poor connection opportunities and make trips take a lot longer just because of the lower frequency. I guess the last thing I'd mention is station closures. We're seeing exceptional station closures in the DC area. I haven't seen as many anywhere else. That's tied to such practical things as shortages of cleaning equipment and shortages of staff. But again, there where you have a network that is built around connections, there are a whole bunch of bus services that feed into a particular station. And if you close that station, the network doesn't work anymore. So I think what I want to say is I'm extremely sympathetic to what transit managers are dealing with right now. They're running on the fly. They're making policy as they go. They're making, I think, mostly good decisions, but they understand that a lot of damage is being done, and they don't see the other side of this for the most part any more than any of the rest of us do.
Wow, yeah. So what I'm hearing are just the juggling of a lot of different decisions, and you mentioned sort of where to start and what are the next layer of considerations and what are the final layer of considerations. If you had to just like stack rank them, just clearly for us right now in summary, what are the first things people should consider, second and third?
The first things transit agencies should consider is getting rid of peak services that are really driven by 9 to 5 demand, because that's gone.
See, that's where I would disagree. The first thing they should do is get rid of all non-essential employees. Okay, that's the first thing they should do. Anybody who's not essential, who's not connected to actually running service, needs to go. Okay, and that money needs to be freed up to get more drivers, more cleaners, and more mechanics, and that needs to be the priority.
Mm-hmm.
What's left is all-day demand. What's left is people who work at the grocery store, people who work at the hospital, people who work in all those kinds of businesses who were always there and who were always the foundation, one of the foundations of all-day transit ridership, but now they're what's left. And so I don't think there's any reason to have any peaking in any transit agency at this point. And of course, going to Saturdays and Sunday schedules is a way of doing that. I think that step 2 is to cut frequencies to 15, where you have very rich frequencies, but to do everything you can to keep them from cutting further, because that's when connections start to fall apart, and that's when travel times really blow out and become unrealistic. That's the second thing. I think the third thing is to look seriously at fares and whether the pitiful amount of fare revenue that you're still going to get at this point is worth the hassles of collection and the hassles of fare enforcement. Now, I don't want to make that sound easy. I talked with I know a couple of transit agencies in the South where the homeless shelters have closed. They've thrown all the homeless people on the street. Well, the homeless people could charge their cell phones in the homeless shelter. Now the only place they can charge their cell phones is on the bus. So they're on the bus. And of course, when the weather's bad, the bus becomes a roaming homeless shelter. And if you close the homeless shelter, you can't really blame them. So, all this stuff is happening now. And notice, too, all the ways that, other organizations can dump their problems on the transit agency. We closed the homeless shelter, so now we've got homeless people riding the bus around because that's the only place they can get Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this sort of theme that keeps coming up around sort of the expectations for transit, and sort of it's one of them being ridership and the other one being this full-time sort of cure-all to make sure that we can still get essential workers to where they need to be. I've also noticed on your blog this sort of like the problem with focusing so much on ridership. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of narratives around ridership and what this moment is kind of showing?
Absolutely. This is, I think, what Barack Obama would call a teachable moment. It's an extraordinary moment to reset the conversation about transit and to really grab our journalist friends by the lapels and say, look at what's happening, understand what's happening. We've got to stop talking about ridership as though it is the primary data point for evaluating how transit's doing, which is what most journalists have been doing. Mm-hmm. And, for years.
Yes, it needs to be a utility. Ridership should be irrelevant. It should be operating regardless of ridership, as a utility would be providing electric service to one guy who lives out in the middle of nowhere just because that's what they're supposed to do.
Now, we've seen journalists writing stories about transit ridership going down as though that's evidence either that transit agencies are doing something wrong or that transit is becoming less relevant and, therefore it's something we won't need anymore. Both of those things are wrong. But the first thing you have to understand is that right now, all over the country, transit agencies are proving that ridership is not the point. Because if ridership were the point, they'd have done what the airlines have done, which is to cut things to ribbons. When airlines are seeing a 90% drop in ridership and they're cutting service to the point of almost 90%. Transit agencies are seeing a 90% drop in ridership and cutting service 30%, right? Mm-hmm. Because they have an obligation to the community that an airline doesn't have. And so every time I see a story about, how transit ridership is going, that is framed in a way that allows the reader to think that transit is a failing business, I think that's something we all have to learn how to confront now. It's a completely understandable mistake that a journalist makes when they just approach transit and they haven't thought about it that much, and they assume that the business metrics like that are the metrics that matter. But right now, we all know that transit is essential infrastructure. Transit is why there are people at the hospital to save lives. Transit is why there is somebody, there is somebody to beg to work at the grocery store. But that's always been true.
Yeah.
It's always been true that that's one of the fundamental functions of transit. And it's only now that we have this moment where ridership is clearly not the point. We have to remember, and we have to help our journalist friends recognize that when you write stories about transit ridership going up and down, as though that's a story about whether transit is more or less relevant or more or less successful, that's just not true. And we know that now. We can see that. Yeah. I'll make a pitch here. You can Google an article of ours called The Ridership Coverage Trade-Off, which it's at humantransit.org, where I lay out, what I've been working on for a couple of decades now, which is just helping transit agency policymakers and boards understand that the ridership goals of transit and the kind of leave no one behind goals of transit are just mathematically opposite and lead to opposite kinds of network, and that therefore a responsible public conversation has to actually think about that question and balance those competing goals and choose how to balance those competing goals. And for years, we've been running in our projects public conversations that really focus people on the question and make sure they understand that they cannot simultaneously demand high ridership and demand that we keep that bus with 3 people on it because those 3 people really need it.
Yes. Come on. There's more better questions than this.
Other employees are remote. You've been involved in this last week with a virtual charrette, and this I would just love for you to share a little bit about how you made a virtual charrette work. We're really interested in enabling collaboration between a lot of our different software products. It's something we've invested a lot in, and we're just really curious how that went for you, and I think that would be interesting to the listeners as well.
So for context, what my firm, we do a lot of things, but a big chunk of our work is bus network redesign studies.
Yep.
And these are very collaborative processes with multiple points of contact. And one of the critical phases of these studies is when we actually hammer out a proposed network plan. And we always do this in a charrette. That is to say, we get key people out of the agency, key people from relevant adjacent agencies such as the land use planners, the traffic engineers, sometimes the Department of Transport, the State Department of Transportation. And we get all those people in a room for all day for several days. And we have all the data there. We have a Mylar map stretched out, and I'm drawing on it in colored pens. And everybody is supposed to be watching and conveying views about whether we go left or right here, what this should do, what that should do. The goal of the charrette is that at the end of it, everybody remembers how we got to that design. Even if
what are you talking about?
There's so much obsession with consensus and with inclusion.
Come on.
I think everybody's scrambling to fix those as fast as they can because we may be doing this for a while. I really want to see a lot of conversations about what happens to public outreach now.
Come on.
I was just going to say, it's certainly, there have been ways I've been surprised at how much virtually connecting on certain items has made it even easier and less of a barrier for me.
What does it have? Come on.
Wide ridership fundamentally is not even the most important measure of its success in many places. And the reason for that is this. I expect transit ridership to come back very, very slowly. We all know there's not going to be a day when the headlines say, this is over, go back to your lives as they were. There's going to be a day when the headlines say, okay, you can come out now, but be careful about this and this and this because the virus is still out there and it might come back We know that's going to be the message when it comes. So I think everyone is going to still be spooked about the virus, and that's still going to make them not want to use public transit, even as the city starts moving again. Probable outcome of that is that we'll get a lot of traffic congestion as everyone just tries to go back to driving because they're afraid of transit. We'll end up with lower transit ridership, and therefore all of the social and environmental consequences of low transit ridership, congestion, emissions, and so on, losing out to the single occupant vehicle because that's where people feel secure. That would seem to be an entirely logical path. And before long, people will be out there saying, well, look, transit ridership just never came back from COVID-19. People just must be deciding that transit, it doesn't have a future. They'll always be saying that. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think that's going to be a very perilous time because lots of people are going to be looking who control. I think many of them have learned more sense.
Look, this world has changed, and I don't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know. Nobody knows. We're finished, okay, as a society. That's it. We're done.
Early in this decade, when
moving along,
the transit agencies were required to do things that kept ridership down. The transit agencies were required to do things like run more service than ridership justified. And they absolutely did, and they absolutely had to, and they should have, because they're an essential service. How do we congestion by properly costing for asphalt per capita more agencies in directions that some of the
come on.
And then you have to calculate the cost of putting out additional service. It's good for ultimate work on how they present the project.
I can't watch this.
I think that that's always been the story about rural transit, and that while it's natural with a rural transit agency, I think that we have to think clearly about what could people do without and still get where they're going. So one of the things that often comes up in rural transit is when you often a rural service.
Okay, I don't care
how far that can reach.
I don't care.
So besides New York City, is there any other city in the U.S. putting measurements for cycling as an alternative in transportation for some communities as a resource?
I think that that's outside my expertise, but I bet there are lots of answers in the chat.
Exactly. Just wanted to get that answered in the chat. Okay, so how... and I should also mention that Jared's offered to answer some of these questions that we're recording in the chat box later. So if I don't get to your question,
come on. I want something
how eternal this issue is. Mm-hmm. Because when an issue is eternal, it gives you some permission to deal with it being difficult. And it also gives you some historical perspective on it. Every plague in history has triggered a conversation about how awful and dangerous cities are. It just comes with the plague because, yes, dense populations tend to be where it spreads first. And if you already have cultural hostility towards cities in the society, it will pick up on that. For some reason, though, after every plague in history, the city comes back. There is a reason for the city that the plague did not in any way erase. And that's the thing you have to remember, and that's why it's helpful to have some historians around who will remind you that you are in the presence of an eternal issue, and that history tells us something about how that has worked out. So, Joel Kotkin, for example, who has been arguing against cities for 30 years, was in the Washington Post arguing against cities, like you expect. He's not winning that argument, though, and he's still wrong. I mean, I think we will have the emergence of secondary cities, and that's great. But, the idea that we're going to massively depopulate our dense cities is ridiculous. It's not going to happen, I think, in a big way, because dense cities are just giving us too much of what we need.
Yeah, this one's an interesting question. I'm not... So do you have any recommendations for cities and regions that have multiple transit agencies? And, you mentioned a lot of the connecting services and transfers. And if now is a good time for collaborative resource sharing. They give the example of Los Angeles, but the Bay Area is another example of a place with a lot of different transit agencies.
Well, it's probably a bad time to talk about collaborative resource sharing when absolutely everybody is in dire financial conditions. Nobody is quite sure who should be sharing in that case. It's terrible for all transit agencies right I think that, where I have always been on multi-agency regions is that the key is not to merge them all. The key is to get a clearer definition of their roles and help them support each other by not duplicating each other. But I think that, and I certainly think there is a crucial role for regional governments, metropolitan planning organizations in the United States, to be the place where
This is so
you
boring.
can't just run Sunday services on weekdays forever.
So we do have this upcoming webinar.
All right, this is boring.
For Remix on April 7th.
All right, look, I don't want to watch this. It's just too boring. I noticed how I was right. He never talked about the giant bureaucracy that's supported by American public transportation. He didn't talk about the capital projects, pork barrels. It never came up, and I knew it wouldn't, because he gets his paycheck from that exact part of the public transportation industrial complex that gives it out. He's part of that pork barrel. Okay. Anyway, enough of you, Jarrett. Sorry, you're boring.